Kia ora, everybody. Firstly, I just want to open the space up with a karakia. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa pounamu te moana, he huarahi mā tātou e te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa. Huie taiki.
I'm Nish from the Education Partnership and Innovation Trust, also known as EPITS. I'm proud to be hosting this amazing panel of experts in the field of child data, information and privacy. Today we have with us Angela Webster, Brent Carey, Caroline Keane and Rick Shearer. I'll get them to introduce themselves shortly and share a little bit about their journey that has led them to what they do today. Firstly, a little bit about EPITS. So we're a builder of transformative partnerships which drive systems change, a connector and dot joiner of organizations, businesses and individuals who are looking to create equitable education outcomes for learners across Aotearoa New Zealand. Our office in Onehunga is available to our partners in a co-working type setup. Our purpose is to drive and embed sustainable systems change through collaborative, connected communities and transformative partnerships. We're the first Australasian users of a digital innovation and collaboration platform and are building a highly engaged community. This creates a kete of knowledge and resources where partners are able to share and learn from each other. We also host and facilitate conversations connecting stakeholders across sectors to create a more collaborative approach and increase awareness of work and initiatives that are currently taking place in Aotearoa New Zealand. If you want to find out more, you can head over to our website, www.epit.org.nz. Okay, so I'm going to pass that arco around. So first to you, Angie.
Thanks, Nish. Kia ora. I'm Angie Webster. I come from an education background. I have held many roles in different schools from early childhood to secondary. My journey really started in this space as both a parent of teenage daughters and working in an all-boys school when all things to do with the online space were evolving very rapidly with social media emerging and seeing just very young through to teens using that space, being interested myself. So to cut a very long story shorter, led me to my master's, a thesis in young people's concepts of privacy and in relation to their concepts of privacy, what they did, their behaviours online. So it's a really fascinating piece of research. So I am very passionate in this space. It led me then to a wonderful career with NetSafe, actually, sort of clocked up about 5 years in total so far as an education advisor, right on the back of NetSafe being approved as the agency under the HDC Act. So it was exciting times. I went on to found Generation Online, which I am currently working in, as a result of just the very broad needs that were arising from schools and kura, that at that time at NetSafe, we weren't able to meet those needs in a way that they were asking for. So in many ways, that's been a real joy and a real challenge because I can respond in a variety of ways. I make a lot of bespoke resources as things crop up in the secondary space. This year's been really lit up with, people like Andrew Tate and things like that. So how do we respond? And in Generation Online, I've got that capacity to respond very, very quickly to that. So I'm a advocate of research and how to apply that at the coalface, and that is my passion, and to do it in ways that are positive. For young people. So well-being is a really big focus in my work as well.
Thank you for that. Now we'll pass it over to Brent.
Kia ora katoa, ko Taranaki te Monga, ko Tangacha te Awa, ko Te Atiawa te Iwi, ko Ngāti te Whiti Hapu, ko Brent Carey toko ingoa. Haere mai, haere mai, haere mai. My name's Brent Carey. I'm originally from Taranaki. My first job was at the Privacy Commissioner's Office here in New Zealand. So I'm pretty passionate about privacy. That led me to an international role in Australia, working for the Privacy Commissioner. And more recently, I've returned from Australia, where I was looking after the .nz domain name space. And in May, I took up this role as the NetSafe CEO. And we're very passionate about supporting people to have safe and positive online experiences. So thank you for having me.
Kia ora, and thank you for being here. Brett, on to Caroline.
Oh, hi, kia ora. So I guess just reflecting on Angela's journey and thinking about my own, I wasn't going to go back that far. I guess, okay, so I started life as an anthropologist / archaeologist working in the Pacific. Then I went to business, did commercial research, marketing, advertising, which is a nice sort of background to today's discussion, I guess. In about 2008, I worked with a firm that we were selling into New Zealand their child exploitation filter, which did happen. So the DIA purchased that. And I was working with this company, with other governments, specifically Australia and the UK, largely those countries, trying to sell them the idea that perhaps we should block child sexual abuse material. And but in that space, Australia was having a very interesting debate about censorship of pernicious content online. And so I withdrew from work life and went back to do a doctorate looking at how governments, private interests, and the civic or civil sort of sector negotiate how they're going to regulate content in the interests of children. And then the result of that is, I guess, states don't successfully regulate in that regard. So that'll be an interesting, perhaps that'll come into our discussion at some point. But since then, I decided to start socio-digital research, and I've been working in the area of digital inclusion, and also children's data privacy. And so I've conducted some research projects since that time, which is about 2017, I think, and then got some academic publications through on that. So hopefully making an impact in that space, and also trying to do a bit of advocacy work and public facing work in the area of children's data privacy, because I'm quite passionate about that. Anyway, so that's me.
Awesome, thank you, Caroline. Kia ora. And Rick.
Hi, kia ora tātou, ko Taranaki te Monga, ko Hawaii te Awa, no Hawera ahau, ko Shira tōko whanau, ko Rick tōko ingoa. Haere mai, haere mai, haere mai. I'm Rick Shearer, I'm a lawyer. I come from, like Brent, I come from Taranaki. You can see behind me my Monga. I come to this because I've been hanging around the internet for far too long. And the internet, when it first started, was this interesting little thing that looked quite unusual, a bit of an oddity. And since that time, and I should say, since that time, the last century, which makes me seem very old, but last century, it seems to have gobbled everything up. So as a lawyer in this space, it seems to have taken everything over. And so what that means for me is it's a bit like pouring old, new internet wine into old legal bottles, because law doesn't really respond that quickly to changes online or anywhere else. As a result of that interest, when I came back to the UK, where I'd worked for a little while, I got involved with Internet NZ, which runs the .nz domain name space, which Brent has mentioned also. And through Internet, ended up on the council and in a governance role there, and then got interested in this little organisation at the time, which was called, at that time, the Internet Safety Group, and had, I think, 1.5 people involved with it, met in a classroom in Mount Albert, and was right there at the start of this thing called the internet, and more importantly, the online environment for children, which was recognised with great foresight by, I should say, New Zealand Police, other safety groups and so on at the time, as something which we should all start to be aware of as to how it was going to impact children and other aspects of society. That organisation morphed and grew. I became chair soon after, as many lawyers end up doing. And it grew from the 1.5 people up to, as Ange and now Brent would know, up to its current status. Moved into premises and all of those sorts of things that growing organisations do. And in large part, the issues which initially we thought were going to be children's issues in terms of the online environment grew as children grew over that 2 or 3 decade period of time into adult issues. And so NetSafe was, because there was no one else really doing these sorts of things and looking at the societal and safety issues around the internet use and online behaviour, NetSafe was somewhat reluctantly at times pulled into having to deal with things like scams and online issues, rapidly moved into things like online bullying and cyberbullying and so on and so forth. So, and as a result of that, there was a large push made by government and others to do something to create a law in this area to deal with these sort of problems, which eventually gave rise to the Harmful Digital Communications Act in 2015. NetSafe was at the forefront of both making sure that, or trying to make sure that law would be appropriate, and also eventually became the approved agency under that law, which is the body which is the first port of call for cyberbullying concerns, which might then go through to legal avenues, which we'll no doubt talk about in a bit more time. So I stayed on the NetSafe board as chair for far too long, because every time I wanted to get off the board, something new and exciting and interesting would come along, and I decided that it would be far too boring just to leave it alone. So I stayed on for quite a while and retired from the board in 2020. And so that organisation is going from strength to strength under Brent's now mandate, and that's what I do. In my day job, as it were, I do quite a lot of IT, intellectual property, cyber security, as well as cyber safety, and general business law as well, based up here in Auckland.
Kia ora. Thank you, Rick. And again, I just want to acknowledge the expertise, knowledge, and wisdom in this space, but also in a wider space that we have on the panel here. So thank you again for making the time to commit to this important kaupapa. So thank you. Kia ora, my name is Nish. I don't have any sort of education background. I've taken a very varied path to get here, but I guess my proudest achievement that I claim now is that I'm a father of 2. And I've got a 14-month-old and a 4.5-year-old who's about to start school. Just over a year ago, when this job popped up, and my then 3.5-year-old, I thought, if we can work together in a way to create a system that works for her and for my second, who was just born at that point, why wouldn't I be part of? Why wouldn't I be driven to be a part of that? So that's really what brought me to EPIT. And then we've just managed to go from strength to strength in the last sort of 12 months or so, operationalizing and then being able to build a community and network around us of experts and people like yourselves who are knowledgeable in this space of educational equity. So we've been very privileged and lucky to be working in this space. So yeah, that's just a little bit about myself. So let's dive into these questions. And again, I just want to acknowledge that there is going to be some interesting conversation, and I'm very much looking forward to it. So the first question I'm going to pop up, what are the differences between the data and privacy of children compared to that of an adult? So I might start this off with Caroline.
I don't think there's any difference. We're all subject to the same sort of corporate surveillance, if you like. But I would say that the consequences for today's children are extremely significant because they are being datafied since pre-birth quite often. And so the amount of data collected about them that documents not only their personal upbringing, but also within schools, their educational pathway and successes and failures, etc. Behavioural analysis of those sorts of things it's a whole pile of interesting data collected by potentially unknown parties. We haven't really explored how this works in any great depth. Partially that's perhaps largely due to the parties that are collecting this data. It's their IP, and there's a very big lack of transparency around it. So later in life, decisions essentially are being made. That's automated decision making, right? From data collected about you, but also from data that's generated from that data, which is what we call a profile. So children today really have no idea who will have that access to that information and how it will be used and what decisions will be made, but potentially it can actually prevent and exclude, if you like, children when they become adults from accessing opportunities. So we already have discussions in this space around access to housing and finance and education. But also I'm doing another interesting project at the moment, which is looking at the recruitment industry and the use of AI in that currently, which is just developing at such a fantastic rate without, and as yet, again, a bit like these issues, hasn't had the kind of scrutiny and regulation in that area. So when we apply for a job now, there's a lot of AI that goes on before potentially you get seen or your CV gets seen by a human being. Now, if data is accessed from social media automatically and assertions are made about that person through algorithms that are put into these systems by people building these systems for specific purposes, of which there is, it's just none of those purposes would potentially be the same, because you might have organizations that are developing these systems, large corporations, or you might have industry players that are developing products and selling them into smaller sort of recruitment areas. So potentially today's children, in a nutshell, their whole childhood is being datafied and is becomes kind of a permanent and repurposed form of data for decisions. Every time they apply to do something or have access to something, those decisions are made before them. You know, they may not actually have the opportunity or even know that they're, you know, that these decisions are excluding them from opportunities later in life. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant. Very passionate about it.
No, so part of what I'm hearing from yourself is actually one of the consequences, and it might be an unintended consequence, is that there's just a more longevity of data collection and gathering about a child versus an adult. And that's potentially the key difference in this space, is that they've actually got more data about a child just because that now they've got access to that child and as a learner at a much younger age, whereas an adult, as Rick pointed out, you know, we're 30 years in, but that may not have happened for a large part of that period, but it's definitely happening now.
It is happening now, yeah. And I guess for someone like myself at my age, I've already had my mortgage, you know, I've already been to university many times, you know, so I guess that automated decision making for those really key sort of life opportunities is less relevant for me than it is for a child that's just becoming an adult and starting their life. Yeah.
Brett or Angela, Brett, would you guys like to add anything further to this?
I'll just add a couple of quick observations. One, that privacy is a fundamental human right, and it's recognised internationally, even in the rights to children around privacy. So privacy is a balancing act. And so it comes out a lot in the adult children arena, and especially around really important issues like purpose, like why are you collecting that child's information? Notice, like what notice are you giving to people that they can easily read and understand, and at a child's reading age, and also consent. So it comes up particularly in issues around informed consent? Is it voluntary? And in my area, when young people want to rebel or express themselves online and get more autonomy, especially in that 10 to 14-year-old age group, they'll want their social media account, they'll want their first phone, they have rights. So how do you have those conversations together as a whānau and as a family?
I think that sort of leads us to some of the next questions, about consenting. So when signing up a class for a web service, what steps should a teacher, IT administrator, or a parent take in terms of getting and giving consent on behalf of their child?
I think that it does segue from the last discussion, and I was going to mention in respect to the last one that one of the difficulties that is experienced is, as Carolyn said, children and young people have exactly the same privacy rights, certainly under New Zealand law, as everyone else. The difficulty comes when you're trying to actually do anything about that, because agencies may not necessarily respond or to a child or a young person complaining about a breach of their privacy. They may say, well, where are your guardians or parents or your whānau who should be involved in this discussion? The child or young person may not in fact want their adults to be involved in that discussion, because it may be something to do with their growth, their sexuality, their choices in terms of their lifestyles and so on. And so that becomes quite difficult, because legally they may not have the legal authority to make decisions for themselves, or in terms of informed consent, may not have given necessarily proper informed consent because they were too young to do so. So that can be quite a challenge in terms of how that gets dealt with. It's not an unusual challenge in the space of dealing with young people. The courts deal with young people by appointing guardians, lighting, or other mechanisms that they have, but it is something that does need to be worked through at times, and it's something that can be, one has to be careful of, not just to jump in and say, well, you're only a young person, you don't really have any rights, or and can't really agree to anything yourself, and therefore we're going to run roughshod over your rights by imposing a parent or a guardian in that space. So that's something, because as we've said, the children and young people do have the same rights. So we have a children's commissioner that can be helpful in that space as well. In terms of that informed consent, it flows through to that, because and websites, to be fair to them, find this incredibly difficult. It's almost impossible to know who's a dog on the internet, as they say, and who is a child or not, or a young person, or who has the ability to give informed consent. So teachers, as guardians ad litem, as the legal term is said, who are standing in the position of parents when children are at school or in an educational facility, need to take on that role of making sure that the young people, to the extent that they can, understand what exactly they're getting into, and take on the role of ensuring that the spaces that they're signing these people up to, if they're going to have direct involvement, are safe spaces. And that comes back to, I think they're called the NAGs. Ange, you'll probably know better than me, but the NAGs, the National, whatever that acronym stands for, under the Education Act, one of which apply to all schools, public sector or private sector, but the one that does apply, they don't apply to all schools, public and private sector. The private sector has a much more limited obligation under the Education Act, but one which does apply to everybody is the obligation to keep young people safe, and that includes the online environment. So teachers have a responsibility to fulfil that obligation.
Mm. Yeah, so look, my response to this, bringing this right down to the coalface of a practical tool. So what I recognised out in the field over this time is that when we think about consent, staff themselves are so busy, they're just getting on with the learning and teaching. And there's so much that's around this in the periphery around ethical, legal, guidelines, regulations, expectations, communication with whānau, etc. And so because I have a passion around bringing this to something pragmatic to raise awareness and to nudge thinking and practice, I created a tool. So, I mean, you can't read it, but it's like this. So it's just a little self-check. And when I work in schools, and it's free on my website, it is just a one-pager to nudge the thinking around when using digital tools and online sites in learning and teaching. And so it goes down and around different topics. For example, selecting the tool. So when a teacher signs up for a web service, they're making a selection. So making sure that the thinking behind, is that the right tool? Is it purposed for what we're wanting out of it? So there's been some thought and critical thinking gone into it. Is it effective and is it safe? So, the little sort of sub things to nudge thinking. There are age restrictions. So being very careful that the tool's being used for the different ages and the different levels. Is the teacher familiar with the terms and conditions of the site themselves? Now, some of this you'd think this would be like a leadership thing. This is for leaders to know. And then this is for the Ministry of Education to know and to have some sense that schools then could lean into the confidence that the Ministry of Education say these sites are safe, robust, and we promote their use. But nothing really exists like that here. So we're all in this sort of working very individually, and all schools are individual in the tools they choose. But I'm making sure, have you looked at the T's and C's? Privacy, not only just privacy concepts that we're talking about here, but privacy in and in the use of it. So does that staff member know who can see their students' content and information? Do they know if there are, the restrictions around that content going in there in terms of privacy to do with images, and parents withdrawing the right to have images or information about their child in online spaces? And then we've got the Vulnerable Children's Act, communicating with whānau clearly what tools are being used, why they were selected, how, safety is an aspect and risks are mitigated. And keeping them, on that journey as well. Risks and support, so making sure that teachers have thought through what could go wrong when I'm using this. And therefore, what would my actions be? What do we do in our school? What's our policies and procedures? The longevity of content. Now, this is a really big one for me. So, children are on these learning platforms and on school websites with images and work and etc. And some of the schools, we try to keep it really light, but they'll have a bit of a giggle that they've got kids who are now, parents who are the student face of something on their school website. And so that ethical and legal aspects of privacy are quite interesting. What may not be illegal may not be ethical around privacy. So when we think about consent and we think about children, inviting them along the journey. So one of the resources I also have for young people is to kōrero around privacy and say, when you move on to your next school, what's going to happen to all of your stuff, all of that cool learning? What do you think happens with it? And then that may raise thinking around, well, what does happen to it? And therefore, what are my rights? And what is the ethical responsibility of a school or kura to making sure that they've got guidelines around how long they keep content? Then there's things like, for example, staff in schools will grab their own phone to take photos of the learning of the students and pop them up pretty quickly into Seesaw and other platforms used, so that parents, whānau, can see what's happening. And it's an ongoing record of learning. But that's then stored on the personal private device of a staff member, and content is clouded often. So it's put in the cloud, and we've got data sitting in different spaces that also carries both risk and then consent. And so I really advocate for the space around children are young enough to be able to understand some of this and to be able to be asked if that's okay. and that they learn early what is consent, types of consent, and what it means, and what are the implications, that they are very much a centre at all of this as well, about what's done to them and with them and about them.
I think I'd just add a little bit to that too. That's really a fantastic overview of, I guess, what we knowingly see and give and produce. So children are in this environment, they're using systems, and I guess they're knowledgeable, and the teacher is asking them, and it can be in a kind of a public, a class setting. It can be put into newsletters, but it's also their kind of portfolio, if you like. But it doesn't, there's another layer to that in terms of, the student management systems, the Google Classrooms, etc. And the whole range of EdTech that might be utilised in the process of doing that, in the performance of education, but which actually examines and allows access to that data to third parties, or directly sends data to third parties. And at that point, we've lost that data. That data is then being generated, aggregated, and that's where the profiling is happening. And it's in a commercial space that's happening. It's not inside the education system. And this is really key, because post-COVID, there has been worldwide sort of concern. And one of the reports that came out from the Human Rights Watch talked about how governments had basically said these EdTech are good, right? It was during COVID that they really encouraged and sanctioned the use of systems and a range of EdTech. And I think something like 39, is it, out of 40 something were actually actively mining data, children's data, but governments had said these are okay. So we're at a stage globally where we need to revise and revisit what happens in schools, because our old thinking about schools as kind of a traditional institution that cared for your child while you weren't at home, home and school, and that they'd be protected from the outside world, right? That's changed because we've privatised education through bringing all this EdTech into it, but we've done it without really considering, that relationship and the data that's going out. So that leads us to a really big discussion that needs to happen, and it's happening elsewhere. Like in the Netherlands, governments have come down real hard on Google, and
Yes.
Germany, Denmark, we've got lots of laws. For instance, Google has to comply with the Californian laws, privacy laws in California, the GDPR there, but because there is a contract that is not completely transparent, but our work with the Privacy Foundation has kind of revealed that the government didn't really sort of look at this aspect. And although the agreement, I guess, basically says, yes, it complies with New Zealand law, okay, it excludes them from having to actually apply the same regulations and protections that we do in the GDPR in California, etc. So Google is compliant with New Zealand law, but New Zealand law isn't really a data protection law, and it's not looking at this issue. I'd like to hear what Rick has to say about that.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, Rick, would you like to comment on
Have
that?
a discussion about the law.
Yeah, really interesting issues, and of course, the what you've adverted to, Carolyn, is the elephant in the room, which is that the fact that most of these platforms are not New Zealand based, and the law which applies to them is not New Zealand law. So we're all, if it wasn't difficult enough to try and get your head around the fact that things are going online and outside the school gate, as it were, into an online platform, when that online platform is a Google or any other, Facebook or Meta or any of the other places that are now processing that data. and they're all overseas and based on overseas law, it gets very, very difficult to consider what the ramifications of that are. Some countries are obviously better at this than others. If you're in California, you might have a degree of comfort. If you're outside California, you probably have very little comfort. So in the United States, because most of them don't have particularly good privacy laws in the state, and there's no real federal law yet. So GDPR, yes and no, in terms of Europe and places, and other countries are the same. So it's a real patchwork quilt of laws which try and deal with these sorts of things. And in any case, what are you going to do? If you're an individual, child, adult, very difficult to do anything. So those sorts of discussions have to be done on a jurisdiction, country to country sort of basis, or by international organisations, human rights organisations, UN, those sorts of organisations entering into treaties and so on. So it's whilst coming right back to the idea of what should a teacher do. Yes, the reading of the T's and C's. Good luck with that. I write these damn things, and it's a two-edged sword when the GDPR says you've got to explain everything to everybody about what's going to happen to their data. Trying to do that in less than 20 pages is very difficult, and then trying to get non-lawyers to read 20 pages worth of, as much as we might struggle plain English, but somewhat legalese, is almost impossible. And even when you read it, it doesn't necessarily tell you what's going to happen to the data and the private information, personal information at the end of the day anyway. So I think to try and work out at a high level, and there is better work being done about this in terms of analysis of different platforms and how they deal with information. They themselves are trying to do it, but it is actually not easy, very difficult. But they themselves are trying to give summaries as to what happens to personal information, and at least trying to get an idea of that. It would be great if the Ministry of Education, or Te Whatu Ora as it's now, in terms of the health system and so on, if they could come out with some sort of guidance as to which platforms do what with personal information and children's information, and also what they do with, as Carolyn was pointing to, the metadata, the information that they're collecting about who's clicking what, how long they're staying, wherever they're staying, what sort of information that how often they're interacting with the site. I was a director of Network for Learning, which provides the ISP services to all schools in kura in New Zealand, or 99% of them all. And even that they provide the filtering and safety filtering and so on to schools through using Fortinet. But I mean, even at that level, where you're not really dealing with eyes on content, there is a lot of information which Network for Learning, or indeed any other ISP or any telco, collects these days about the use of the internet and what sites are being visited and how often the people go there and what they're doing, etc. So even, I mean, that's very difficult for a teacher or anyone else to deal with, but it's something to be aware of, I guess, and it's an education point, because children, while we as adults and children can't necessarily understand all that's going to happen to these things, and we rely on others to tell us, it's a learning experience for them, and indeed for many adults, to explain, look, this is what happens when you go to a website, or this is what happens when you use an app. You may think that you are just, loading a video to TikTok and that's it. But there is a huge amount of collection of data and your interaction and so on about that, and which is used for various other purposes, not just by TikTok, but they sell it or whoever else is using it. So just that explanation around, when I use the internet and when I use platforms and when I use apps, this is what happens, is very useful. And that's part of informed consent, not in a legal sense, but in a societal sense, and an understanding going forward.
Lots of issues there.
Yeah. But, you popped a few things there that I was going to probably talk about in some other sections, but you mentioned around, that there are some endeavours to have some resources that would tell us more about some of the platforms. And I want to highlight here what I think is a great piece of work, early work, that Common Sense Media are doing. They're a US-based organisation, and they have a site for educators, a site for just the general public where they may look at reviews on books, online games, apps, movies, and they provide a lot of information. Also, people can also add to that. The point being, in their site, they have a section there. They have two really interesting sections. They've just added a new piece there around a whole privacy principles. And it's, Rick, I don't know if you've seen this, but it's massive. There's this huge piece there around what policies and terms and conditions on sites could, should, might share, and what to look for. And it covers a gamut of the type of data collected and what are terms and conditions saying about that. From behavioral data, health data, geolocation, the security of the data, the consent to on-share, all of that, which we've been talking about. But they're really reaching out and trying to bring a resource into the hands of more people to open up that thinking and to prompt policy. And yeah, I guess choice and behaviour at a leadership and at a sort of more, a higher level than perhaps just an educator, but putting it in that space. Also, they have, which I think is very powerful for educators, they have listed a whole lot of different learning platforms and apps that we might use in the classroom. And there is, and for parents can look at this too, there is a whole section there on the privacy of that. And they rate it, sort of out of, 5 stars, and, they'll put the reasons why something is, quite robust and why it isn't. And then it leaves it up to the users to make that decision. But they're trying to create go-to resources to help educate and inform pre-use of sites and things. Security of the data is really an interesting one, because we're talking about rights to privacy and consent, but the thing is around the security of that data and, a breach of that. And I know that there are some questions that probably pertain a bit more to that coming up here.
Yeah. And actually, there's a couple of questions that we can segue to now, even stepping back, because it's been identified that teachers are always keen to find ways to engage students using new digital, tech and platforms and things like that. And often they seem free, nominally free, but require data of the student to sign up and use. And concerns that I heard from teachers are around where the data is stored and how it's used and things. So, from what I've heard of the conversation so far, is there a need for a localized kete of schools who've gone through that process? Because capacity is probably the biggest issue. When you're asking teachers who are already under the pump to deliver a whole bunch of curriculum, and schools generally, to also do this exercise of legalese, as you say, Rick, and analyze every single tool that they are using, whether there is a need or there's something to be gained by having that as a nationally available resource if the MOE are not doing that per se, and whether that is their role in the future or whatever that looks like. But if there's already schools that are engaging some part of their capacity to doing this, whether that then becomes a collective knowledge type situation.
It's interesting you say that. At the moment, the Ministry of Education just publicised that something they've been working on and is being trialled, and it's apparently quite a good tool. It's it manages information within schools and kindies. Terito, T-E-R-I-T-O. It's a $1 billion project. Well, it's on hold at the moment because the Ministry of Education cannot guarantee its security. And so here, something that's been a huge focus, millions of dollars underway. It's going to be fantastic, big pause, stop. So yeah, really, really difficult. If it's not the MOE, who is it? And, should it not be the MOE?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing that people need to be aware of is that there is no such thing as guaranteed security. Everyone, if they don't know they've been hacked, then it's just that the hacker has been good at hiding their tracks. You know, there's all sorts of information which is available and has been leaked, whether it be your email address or, you know, all sorts of things is all out there. It's been pawned, as they say. So that also is an education thing for teachers, for the executive teams in schools, and indeed for the Ministry of Education. The idea that you could create some sort of data ocean that would be sacrosanct and secure and never have any data leaked is just a myth. So what that leads you to is much more care around what goes into that data ocean or data lake or whatever you want to call it, in terms of that information, and particularly as Caroline has said, for children and young people, because that builds up over a period of time and is therefore a great massive honeypot for anyone who wants to obtain that information and sell it, because it's extraordinarily valuable. You know, to have masses of information about young people who are going to grow up and become adults over a period of time is just a huge value, because, you know, they could be targeted directly with things like games and in-game apps and in-game purchases and all sorts of things like that, or, you know, they're obviously less careful in their online interactions and therefore are much more susceptible to scams and all sorts of misadventure online. So, you know, those sorts of things are extremely valuable. Children are often the people in people's homes who are in the network at home, and therefore any security breach that they might bring also is likely to be a security breach in the home. Many more people are now working from home, and therefore that's a great entree for a scammer or a hacker criminal to get into a home network as well, and thereby into a work network because you're working from home. So I think that where I come back to from that is that the security aspects of this are also very, very important. And people need to realize that at some stage it's likely that have an expectation that at some stage the data that I put anywhere on the internet, whether it's via a platform or anywhere else, could actually be leaked out. It tends to make you think about what you're putting online.
Brett, you look like you've got something on your mind.
A bit like Angie, I'm wanting to be practical. So there was just a few things that could be useful in this space. One of them is the NetSafe website, which Angie has worked amazingly on the curriculum there for a number of years, and there's some really good content. We're creating a digital kete ourselves for February when school resumes, because at that time of the year is when people are thinking about their, you know, social media policies, their response to cyberbullying, those sorts of things. And just last week, and Angie was involved in this project as well, together under the Grok Academy, we launched the Cyber Schools Aotearoa learning modules, and there's actually a competition running now, which young people can access to, mainly on privacy and security as the first topic, and try and out-scam a scammer. And that's free for everyone to get involved in. We're also giving away e-smart licenses to everyone under our partnership with the Alana and Madeline Foundation. That's actually been reviewed against the New Zealand curriculum and meets those requirements. And that's another practical way to teach young people to be digitally savvy online. And then in February, we're launching our micro learning moments with the Ministry of Education. And nowadays it's really hard to keep people's attention for too long. And so we're looking at short modules to teach people good online behaviors. Our first topic is around the growing issues around body dysmorphia and body imagery with young people. And we've got a campaign called body right at the moment, to encourage people to go filter free on their social media platforms and to be a bit more real with their imagery. And we're going to be developing more of those learning moments. So we'd love to hear from your community about what would resonate in the classroom.
Rick, you actually touched on something just before in what you were saying. So actually a couple of things, but so what legal rights protect our learners from being exposed to targeted advertising in and outside of school through their devices? Because you can't have advertising in a school, like physical advertising. You can't have that in a school, but they've got access to devices that are collecting their information. They go onto a general, Google search, and they're seeing that targeted advertising come through on the devices. So,
yeah, and again, this the starting point with this obviously is as I said before, a lot of these platforms are not based in New Zealand, so they would argue that they're not subject to New Zealand law. Now, many of us may recall our previous Privacy Commissioner, John Edwards, having an extraordinary Donnybrook online with Facebook about the fact that he thought that they were subject to New Zealand law and they thought that they weren't. My view is that in some areas they probably are, but our Privacy Act was actually amended when it came through, the new act, to make that clearer as far as we could. So that's the starting point, is that sometimes it's quite difficult to impose New Zealand law on these overseas platforms. But in terms of targeted advertising, we have, I guess, a couple of pieces of law that probably will or a few pieces of law that will deal with some aspects of that. Obviously, the Harmful Digital Communications Act, it's an online thing. You wouldn't expect any advertising to be harmful, but there may be circumstances where some of it could be argued that way. Probably unlikely, but it might be a starting point. There's obviously the Privacy Act in terms of how has the person gained that information in order to target that person. What sort of information are they using? Are they using it for the purpose for which it was originally given? Probably not, if it's advertising that's trying to sell them something which is completely different from the environment in which they provided their contact information. So there's that. And then there's things like the Fair Trading Act, which would potentially apply if a child was being misled or anything like that. And then there's the more informal areas of law, like the Advertising Standards Authority and their codes of practice, which do carry some provisions relating to the advertising to young people, and that it be appropriate or indeed not be targeted at young people if it's not in the right area. And things like broadcasting standards, for example, have free zones and so on in terms of the times of night that you can advertise to children. So there are some areas. It's pretty difficult though. The platforms themselves would say, well, how do I know that little Johnny who signed up to Facebook was little Johnny? He didn't say he was 13. He said he was 27. So, they find it difficult as well.
I'd quite just like to pitch in on that one. I think that especially these large organisations, they're collecting enough data to estimate age quite accurately, and I think there's studies that are done on that. But I'm just thinking about how, I guess there's a difference, the existing laws that you've just sort of mentioned really apply, I guess, to the kind of, I'm producing an advert, find me an audience, whereas the data collection side of things is a very individualized process. And it's not just advertising that's directed at children, it can be information, right? And we've got that debate about disinformation, misinformation, etc., hate speech, all those sorts of things, so that if we allow businesses to collect data unfettered, right, unimpeded by some kind of regulatory oversight, then we can't sort of interfere with that process. Our children are exposed just as adults are. They go to school, they're not protected. They go home, the discussion, the debate hasn't been had. They don't know what they should do. Parents have no idea or awareness of how this is going to affect them later in life. So, you know, we're not going to get anywhere. And I think the question that you asked, Nish, about when signing up for a class or a web service, what service steps would a teacher or IT administrator take? I think the part that schools can play, they currently produce their own policies. They need guidance and help, and they need resources to address this issue. But I think that we should start the conversation around minimising data collection from children, full stop. I mean, why should we be allowing businesses to profit from children, especially in the educational space? But why should we be doing that? You know, why shouldn't they be protected from this? Because it's much more pervasive and severe than pre-internet. You know, we have a completely different scenario that's playing out here. So I think schools, you know, I have chatted with a few IT people in schools who have known about this. Some of them make the call themselves without any discussion, whether they turn off certain functions with Google, etc., that allow data collection. And, you know, the ones that they do get to manage, you know, they can physically sort of review those terms and conditions, and perhaps there can be a discussion in the school. But what is interesting to be aware of, there was a study, actually, it's by Lightspeed Systems, who look at analytics, right? And this is in the States, but it's saying that your average school, in your average typical school, 99% of usage is from approximately 300 apps per school. So that in any school, that could be the amount of educational technology apps, system software, whether that's for security, cloud storage, whether it's for third-party analysis, behavioural analysis, measurement, administration, etc. So that's a lot of companies in schools collecting, using children's data. And I think also in the UK, this debate is very hot. And there's been another really useful report that's come out. And one of the things is we've got to really question, you know, whether we allow the commercialization of children's childhood, you know.
Exactly.
It's kind of, it's surveillance is so pervasive, it's becoming normalized, and we shouldn't, I don't believe we should allow that to happen without any debate and without people's awareness. But basically that's what's happening, you know, by allowing this to go on in schools. We're basically normalizing data collection about you. And if you do have chats to younger people today, I've got a son who's 25, and we used to have quite, you know, good, robust discussions about privacy. Children really want their privacy, and I guess I have done work in this area, you know, talking with parents and children about how they understand privacy, and they're very passionate about being private, using privacy settings as they want, and making conscious decisions about the sort of information they want to share with their peers. They don't want to share with their parents. They don't want their grandmother to see, all that sort of thing. And that's around relationships, right? It's about managing our privacy and having the right to have private relationships as we grow, right? So there's all that sort of personal side of things. But now we have to consider what I call decisional privacy, right? So data, metadata, data that's created about you and is making decisions about your, you know, who sees that sort of information, who sees that sensitive data. That is a hard-won privacy right from the 60s, you know, that we seem to have just lost as we've gone along, you know, because we can't see it. We can't see what companies and third parties are doing with this data, and we can't see governments who are buying this data and what they're doing with it. You know, that happens too. So we have a situation where we think we have decisions over whether to share our sexuality online, or you know, whether a boss or potential employer should know sensitive things about you, right? We think we have control over that, but we don't, through this whole process of data mining and corporate surveillance and what happens with that data. That's just, you know, one example of what might be sensitive. But if that information gets into the hands of those who are in a position of power, such as a recruiting agent, etc., then you have no form of redress. You don't know that they've got the data. You don't know they're making a decision on that, on the basis of that. And people are very aware, and the kids too, about, oh, what you put on social media might be seen by a potential employer, but they're not aware of the data that's being assembled in the background and who has access to that, you know, in the future, and how that will affect their opportunities. Sorry.
Yeah, interestingly, the Privacy Commission, and I don't know if this consultation is finished yet or is still going, but they're consulting on that very issue of should third parties who receive data from someone else, so Google collects data from someone and then passes it on to someone else who wants to buy that data from Google, should that someone else who buys the data from Google be obligated to tell the end user that they have collected that data and in turn what they're going to do with it? And that consultation is happening at the moment. It would open a huge can of worms for the information industry. But some of these laws are in place overseas. How well they're working is difficult to tell, I must admit, but it's certainly being consulted on here in New Zealand. The one thing I would say also about that point you made, Karen, is that some of these tools are exceptionally good in the education setting. Google Classrooms and so on. It's the reason it's so ubiquitous is because it's very good and it's very helpful to educators. So one thing which I've always wondered about, and you get this when you, for all about everyone will know, you get these horribly annoying European sourced cookie questionnaires whenever you go to a website. Do you want to click on a cookie to accept it or not? Yep. And you never know, you never have any idea what it means to say yes or no or maybe or whatever, unless you go to the nth degree of trying to work out what it actually means. It would be useful, very difficult job, but useful, I suppose, if an educator could know, look, if I turn off these privacy settings, or if I don't supply this information, what's it going to do in terms of the utility of the platform or app that I'm actually using? Because, at the end of the day, educators are not using these, want to do the right thing. It's just that they don't have the tools to decide what is the right thing.
Well, there's lots of really interesting points that you've made in there. If you look at Apple, they've made huge advances. They've become privacy focused. So you can look at an app and you can see what data is and isn't being collected. And if they don't have a policy down there, they're collecting data that they don't need for the purposes of that app. And that's the second question. A lot of education apps and consumer apps collect data that is totally unnecessary. They are tracking you across the web for the purposes of gaining your data for resale, for use and resale. And that's just a fact, and we need education about that. But also, what was the first thing you were talking about?
Just the Privacy Commission, the third-party data.
Right, the third-party data. I think the bigger discussion to have here is around consent. I think you should be able to opt out. And if a service doesn't allow you to opt out, then they're collecting data. It's as simple as that. We need education and awareness around that. So we also need some kind of guidance, whether that's regulatory, whether it's law. It's got to be a little bit more, I think, than just industry self-regulation and copying what's happening overseas necessary. We can certainly learn some things. Currently, I guess the government is looking they're looking at overseas examples. So the idea of a privacy pledge you know, that an EdTech company signs on to that. I know that the EdTech industry in New Zealand are trying to draft something up. I've read a draft, but essentially it's still about their commercial interest, you know. And that shouldn't happen without debate about how we want to protect and defend children's data privacy rights in New Zealand. There's really been very little advancement from, and it's just on the cusp, I guess, of happening, from the Children's Commissioner. You know, I've tried talking with them, and they're, you know, they haven't really yet taken up with the digital rights, or there's something called General Comment 25, which laid out a vast array of digital rights for children. Within that is privacy. You know, so there's UN standards, there's Human Rights Watch, there's things and debate happening overseas, and we really need to be thinking about that, and giving a structure, I guess, for teachers and schools to follow. You know, to say this is, you know, because if one school says, well, I'm going to make the decision on behalf of parents as to what systems we use, and that it's imposed, which is predominantly the case, I think, here, then you don't have that ability to opt out, and you've just got to go along with it. And how is that useful? You know, whereas if there's a guidance that says we have a data minimization policy, we don't allow commercial interests to profit from providing education tech into schools. If it goes beyond the specific educational purpose that the teacher is wanting, then it's data collection that's unwarranted. And most of these apps will, and definitely Google, it's very easy to just go from one Google core service, which is supposedly not collecting data, to another commercial Google service, which is. And these apps are not just collecting children's data within the school, right? So they take their devices home, and a lot of educational apps are tracking what they do in their own personal time, and whoever else uses that device, or to add to that scenario as well. So, you know, I think in the States they have FERPA, which is, I guess, a kind of a regulatory structure. It gives some rights around what parents and children's rights might be in terms of privacy within education. So I think we could doing more definitely in this country.
Angie, you look like you've got something to say.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, really interesting points, and there's so many that have been raised. It just keeps, you know, pinging some things. So yeah, I mean, thinking about, you know, these that big sort of governmental agency view on this, it's so critical, because that's where change happens. But, you know, the reality is that there are things that schools can be doing themselves, which you're pointing out, but also where their hands are really tied. And I'm just thinking, like, we have the digital tech curriculum now. It is a big piece of curriculum work that was implemented in schools or they have to implement it well and truly along the path. And that's driving the use of tools, apps, and all kinds of things like that in turn have got capacity to mine data, et cetera, and so when you've got something that's a driving force in curriculum to use and promote that, there's a lot of sticking points there. It's like the horse is already bolted. I love the idea that schools could be like, the green tick, the sustainability tick, of privacy. Wouldn't that be amazing if schools had that capacity to explore and set up parameters around how they use digital tools based on rights, legal, human rights, etc. But again, this horse is bolted and there'd have to be a lot of backtracking. And that leads me to the next question around the decisions made for the use of tools. Who's it for? Who's it benefiting? And some of these tools are benefiting mostly the educators themselves and the connection with home. And there are so many benefits around that. There's the close communication, there's seeing what kids are doing, there's the collation over time of a portfolio of their progress. You know, and those are really, really beneficial. But does it benefit the student? And, you know, putting ākonga in the centre of all of this, and also, you know, postulating, thinking around what's right for them, what's good for them, and are we asking them? Are we drawing on them? And if we go, well, they don't know this stuff, well, we've got a huge responsibility there to bring them along the journey, because we're talking about the online environment. We understand what it does. We know algorithms. Year 1, year 0 children are learning about algorithms through the digital tech curriculum. They can understand what an algorithm is. They can understand that, you know, something builds and it collates and it collects and so on and so forth, you know. So bringing them along the journey, because they work and they learn and they live in this online space. We know from research that what we as adults, what teens and what children need to develop awareness to thrive in that environment for learning and life is they need to know and learn about the online environment, all its nuances, its specs. They need to understand digital skills that will help them to make good decisions in the interests of themselves and others, to navigate the complexities and challenges, to weigh up benefits and risks. They also, the third area is the values and attitudes that accompany all of this. And so in a way, I think the space, we can talk about the legalities and the regulation around privacy when we think children, but we need to also parallel this with ethical, you know, value-based. And I know values can be subjective, but, you know, human rights, you know, stands on the value of human dignity and opportunities for everyone to thrive. Yeah, so those were the things that were popping for me. Carolyn, you spoke about how you too have an awareness that young people care about privacy. And my research was just alive and rich with 11 and 12-year-olds who were the focus of my research about privacy. Now, I didn't say, what does privacy mean to you? Because I would already have attached the concept that privacy has meaning. So I just said, what is privacy? And they came out clearly with a care for privacy around things like personal control and autonomy. It's so important to them at that age and younger and beyond. Personal information and confidentiality, having control over what they who they allow access to and who they exclude from knowing. So very aware. Personal belongings were important to them as a concept of privacy, personal space and solitude, relationships and trust, and physical body and physical safety. My point being is, if we can also, and I've developed resources to have kōrero and promote learning and critical thinking around this, if we can bring them on the journey around, they already have a care for privacy, into how it relates to online, around the online environment, the need for digital skills to support oneself and to develop values and attitudes that also overarch all of this, we're going to bring through a generation who are way more aware and may push for greater change in this as well. So putting them at the heart of it too. That was big, I know. It was there on top, and I just figured it out.
No, and actually, that's actually a really interesting point, right? Because so far, a lot of the conversation has been around, as you say, the MOE, the regulatory bodies, the schools. But where is that space for the student to be able to, I guess, partake in their own decision-making, in their own sort of consenting process? And that, for me, segues into the next question, which I'm going to throw to you, Brent. Just to start this conversation, where is the space for, because again, we've spoken about the educator, Angie, you outlined perfectly the space for the student, the learner themselves. where is the space for the parents? Because that's a huge part of where, what influences a child or a learner. And often parents who have gone through this process and journey of growing up with the internet to a stage where they are now may not have that understanding of what it is that they're saying when they click yes or no on a website that's collecting data or whatever that is. And so you've got the learners, the students, the youth actually being more knowledgeable. And I think about just the other day, we were at my mum and dad's house, and mum had no idea. My 4-year-old got on her phone, unlocked it, don't know how, Chromecast it onto the TV and started watching Bluey. And mum didn't, my parents didn't know you could Chromecast onto their TV. And suddenly they've got this 4-year-old who's watching Netflix on their TV. So what is the space for the parents, I suppose? So I'm going to throw that to open out to Brett.
I'll just say a quick observation is what a beautiful story about what I'm passionate about, lifelong learning as well, and a lovely example of intergenerational teaching right there. And the youth as young as 4 becoming a mentor for your parents in this digital journey. So for the parents, I say, the place for them is right alongside their young person, right alongside, shoulder to shoulder learning as well. And there is tailored content for parents to help, and digital divides, digital literacy is a thing as well. And so organizations like NetSafe, and that we have to recognize, what guidance and what materials, and also the ways that people learn too, right? Video, all the different ways that we visual, audio, how do we learn as well, so that we're getting all that richness, because we know I'm doing a speech this afternoon about the mature age sector and about how rich the silver surfers, as I affectionately call them, and want to engage more online, be it gardening, be it cooking, and enriching people's lives through a positive experience all the time. So that's a long way of saying, shoulder to shoulder, get on board if you're a parent.
Angie.
Yeah, interesting. I'm just thinking, during my years in the space, sort of in an advisory consulting space, those parents who were very aware or working in the tech industry were the ones who were coming through with concerns around the fact that their children had no option other than learning online in the schools. There were fewer unplugged options, and they could not opt out as parents. And they were quite beside themselves with what could they do. And they had approached the schools, and the schools said, this is what we do, we're a Google school, and these are the benefits, and this is why. And they were like, but can you not, accommodate, my child's needs and things like that anyway. So there, certainly there were some parents who were looking then to shift their children into schools that perhaps had more balance with unplugged and online than where their child was. But it was interesting that they came from the tech industry. So one of the things I really do encourage schools to think about is, make sure that you're thinking around unplugged options, and parents who may have a concern for that and a desire for that, alongside the fact that we are going so online. And of course, COVID kind of kicked things out, it was crazy. Parents. So many assumptions we can make about parents when we're in schools. We can think they're neglectful. We can think they should do more, that all of this stuff is on them and they should be knowing. And, parents in turn think that if their kids are learning on digital tech at school, schools should have a responsibility to know about this stuff. So sometimes there's a divide there, and often it's about assumptions, perceptions, and just a lack of communication. And so finding ways to partner together, appreciating that parents, for the most, do care, but are out of their depth somewhat at times, don't know. And so where there can be channels that bring home and school and kura together, and whānau, thinking more positively about, we can have those assumptions, but let's move forward. Let's be progressive and let's communicate and let's share information. Because at the heart of it is our students, your tamariki.
Thank you. Caroline.
Hi. Yes. Okay. So it's an interesting area, parents. And I guess what comes to mind is that in Europe with the GDPR, they've had that opportunity to raise awareness and have some debate about parental responsibilities for safeguarding children's data privacy. And of course, they made a stipulation that member countries could pick an age. I think it was anywhere between 13 and 18, I forget, but different countries have adopted different ages. I think the UK chose a younger age, but that's a kind of a cultural thing. But in essence, they've said, well, we've got some regulatory framework here. We've got some law. We're asking industry to do certain things, increase their transparency about data being collected, and at the same time, parents are responsible for the very younger children, and then children themselves are responsible to manage this form of data privacy. So that hasn't happened here. We need that to definitely happen. In my specific privacy research with families, I even spoke to dads who were working in advertising high up, and IT people in advertising who were dads. And whilst they might have taken a moral position in terms of wanting some sovereignty over their own data or data ownership, they had not thought at all about the data being collected from children through their devices and the apps they were using. So we need that conversation. It used to be sort of regarded as a kind of apathy, a privacy apathy, we might get excited and make a few efforts to sort of manage our data privacy, but then we get a bit slack. Most adults, I guess, think, what does it matter? Because we don't really understand what's happening behind the scenes. It's not visible. So it's very difficult to get a uniform parent response at the moment to this issue unless we raise their kind of level of understanding of what's happening. But that also leads me to, I've also done another project, and the two kind of blend in on this subject. I guess I did interviews with parents and children about how they engage with digital technology to sort of understand how families might impact digital inclusion outcomes for children. And it's very clear that there are cultural and class differences across families as to how they engage with digital technology, what their expectations are of it, and their awareness of how they might use it to their benefit. So we've got our more vulnerable communities who lack that knowledge and sort of worldview, if you like, about how they're going to engage with digital technology and certainly engage with issues around privacy. Very different across families. So it's nice to provide some kind of consistent, strong view with regulation, oversight and policies that schools can sort of see, okay, yeah, that's where we should be, and we should adopt those sort of checks and balances. But we also need to engage, for schools to engage parents in this, and not just through a newsletter or sending out perhaps a consent form for something. I think it needs to be done in a different way that really brings that awareness up. But parents will have different views. And I think, Angela, you said something, and it's been on my mind in terms of going forward with educational material. I think it's really important to give people the freedom to manage in the way they want, so long as they've got the education and the understanding of what it is they're doing. So for instance, myself, I make choices every day about new software that I look at for a variety of purposes, and how I might now present myself on LinkedIn, for instance. Those are constant choices. But now that I'm learning a little bit about how LinkedIn process that data and what they do with it, it's like, oh, okay, so this could be a problem. And now I have to actively manage that with the knowledge that I have about how that shapes who might contact me, talk to me, offer me work, all those sorts of things. So it's about helping children and parents to understand how they can positively engage with some sites and allow data collection if it's going to have a really positive impact, beyond the school. But if it isn't, then, it can have a very negative impact. And the other last detail I'd like to say is that we do have more vulnerable groups of people that are, essentially what the collection of this metadata is doing is really strengthening up the fissures, the kind of separation between those who are in more vulnerable socio-economic sort of groups and others. It's going to make it harder for children to overcome sort of their social backgrounds and economic sort of capital, if you like, and to move past that and sit outside of that. That's a real concern, that it will not help social mobility. So all the work done in schools may be to no avail if automated decisions are happening in the background that sort of still, that say this person belongs in this box and that's that territory, and they do not pass go.
Yeah. It's like that thing, that contextual integrity, the assumption that your information, whether that means like as a school thinking or as an individual level, that you believe that it has been stored and cared for and protected and stays within that. And I think a lot of educators work in that space around, well, everyone's using Seesaw, or everyone's using this, or we're all using Google, it must be okay. That normative thinking that at an educator's level and at a sort of school leadership level too, that we're operating in, and needs to be challenged. And then that social privacy, and what you're talking about there is that ability for data, on an individual or a collective level to then sort people, and those vulnerable groups will always come up vulnerable, and it's not okay. It's not okay on an ethical level or a human right level. Fosters that imbalance. And interestingly, there was something I read where, for example, like in the States, this third party sharing, like in the States, police were able to obtain information by buying it off a third party, but couldn't legally access it through their own channels in the first instance. And like that's an example of,
We only need to look at the Grace Mullane case to see how quickly information comes in, and it's just a completely awful situation.
Clouds perceptions before truth is,
It makes moral value judgments. I think they called a sociologist in to sort of say, well, this is how kids are today, to try and sort of counter the moral positions that some people might be taking. But anyway,
So thank you for that. No, that is it's definitely a varied and interesting approach. Because at this point, it almost feels like it's the parents who are being left behind. More than anybody else, the educators are aware to some degree, and they've got resources to support them, and they are being where there's capacity, capabilities being built. Same with learners to some degree, and that's usually just by access. I get to play with it, so I will learn, and then as I learn, I ask questions and all the rest of it. Whereas the parents have very limited view, and I know that I'd love to know how many parents actually knew that Google Classroom continues to collect data beyond and build that profile of their child. I'd love to know how many parents actually know that. And things like Seesaw and things as well, because I've got to an ECE at the moment, and we're prolific. We'd love to hop on and see their little stories and stuff like that. You know, and it comes through, or I get a message from my wife saying, "Oh, check this out. Here's a photo of whoever it is. You know, this is what they did today," and it's great to see those stories. But as you say, where is that data? Where else is that data being stored, and who else is it being accessed by? So when it goes right, what does it look like?
Data minimization. I think you have to ask too. I mean, yes, educational tech, if we just take the subject down to schools and educational tech, is very useful in bringing great efficiencies. The Google system does that. It creates, it's kind of a managerialization, I suppose, or a datafication of the teaching process. It creates new ways of measuring in micro detail children's minute-to-minute performance. It supposedly might create individual learning programs and responses through algorithms that are examining what children do. But there is actually very little actual research that looks at how or whether EdTech improves learning, improves comprehension, improves critical thinking. It is, after all, basically a data entry and an assessment made and a measurement made, and it's got great benefits for those sorts of things like schools reporting back to the Ministry of Education about how successful this was, and you know what our kids' grades are, and etc. But there isn't really that much research that looks at, beyond the convenience and the efficiencies of these systems, what it's actually adding to education. I've spoken with and interviewed teachers who have a very, you know, encourage a very light digital footprint and use in homes. They're very aware of, like, not just the social impacts, but they choose to try and engage children and their critical thinking, and to be thinking about how they their agency over their decisions in life and choices. But the technology, I just don't see that we've really, you know, we've embraced it, and certainly COVID has really pushed that in, the widespread use of it all. But there's a lot of children that are actually saying, I don't need to go to school, I don't need to interact, I can just do everything online. So we're automatically, you know, we're taking away that really important social aspect of learning, you know, of facing off with a teacher, of being with other classmates, of collaborative work that, you know, isn't actually that achievable necessarily online. Yeah, and taking away options, I guess, as well. I'll stop there. I could keep going.
So I've got a question for you, Rick, but I'll go to Brent first, because I think that from a NetSafe perspective as well, I think it'd be interesting to find out what an ideal state or a good example that you've come across looks like. So Brent, I'll throw it to you first, but Rick, I'd love to know what following that, you know, this kōrero, I'd love to know what an ideal state looks like from a legal perspective. So Brent, I'll throw it to you first.
Yeah, I'm going to not answer by way of example, but I'm going to just make 3 comments briefly. One, choice is where there is choice, and it is real choice. That's always good in a system. Transparency, and next month, for the 5 platforms that have signed up to our Aotea Online Harm Code, they'll be producing their first New Zealand-based transparency reports. And I have had the privilege of seeing some of the data already, and it will be the first time that Meta has some localized data for New Zealand. So I'd encourage people to check out more transparency around what their processes and systems of platforms are doing. And then finally, I want to just do a bit of a call out on anonymity, which is an often forgotten privacy principle. And it might feel strange as we go about our way of working to realize that that's a fundamental privacy right, the right to be anonymous as well. So I'm doing a bit of a call out for what good looks like is giving people anonymity as well.
Thank you. Very much so. And I think that's probably one of the hardest things to find nowadays is to actually, to be anonymous. So Rick, I'll throw it to you, to Rako over to you, or pass it over to you now. So what does good state look like from a legal perspective?
That's difficult. I'm going to say something which is probably quite radical. I have been thinking this for a number of years. In fact, I had a discussion with Judge Harvey probably a decade ago about this, and which is that the regulation of collection is a lost cause. If you use the internet was designed as a copying engine. That's its fundamental purpose, was to copy things and route things around so that if there was a breakage in the fabric of the internet, people would be able to get access to that information by some other means. So that's what it does. It copies packets and sends them all over the place. And that's, fundamentally, that's everything else that's built on top of it does much the same thing. It copies bits and bytes of information and stores them in various places and sends them to various places. So fundamentally, every time you use the internet, something is being collected about you. We didn't worry too much about that in the early days because it was the bits and bytes were very opaque. It was almost impossible to work out what actually was being collected, the content that was being collected. So we didn't worry about it too much. As processing power has become exponentially greater, the ability for the players and the platforms and the telcos and so on to discover what the content is, either by directly inspecting the packets or by inference around what it looks like, who you're interacting with, the various connections, the geo linking, et cetera, the ability to contextualize what that data is, even if you can't inspect it, has become just massive. And so that's data mining, machine learning, AI, all of those sorts of things rely on that huge growth in processing power to be able to analyze things where there's no need to go and get direct consent. The information has been collected already. We just manipulate it. So in some senses, I think to myself, well, that horse is bolted. I'm far more interested in two aspects. One, I guess, is that is happening, but data minimization as a concept is a good thing, and that will, that would push back against that collection of just every single thing that everything wants to keep. As a lawyer, and at times by dint of being a lawyer, a cynic, I would say that where the real push for data minimization is going to come from is the insurance industry. Because the more data you collect, as I said before, the more likely you are to have a hack and to be a honeypot and for that data to go out. And we're starting to see now through GDPR and Australia, more close to home, some pretty serious fines and regulatory consequences of data leakage. And so as a lawyer, looking at, well, if I'm advising a client, what's the risk? And same for a school. If you have an obligation of safety for young people, then the risk of data breach starts to loom much, much larger, and it becomes much more important. So that, in fact, carrot and stick, yes, we'd all love to not collect so much data about everybody and not use it in the ways that we're talking about. But in fact, the stick is that the more data you collect, the more personal information you collect, the more likely that there will be a more serious consequence of a breach. So as I always tell people, look, no matter what your moral commercial imperatives are, collect the minimum necessary data you need and keep it for the minimum period you can, because otherwise your risk is increasing exponentially. And previously there wasn't much risk in terms of data breach. Now there is. And, you know, New Zealand's a bit behind the 8 ball, a long way behind the 8 ball in this area, because our penalties for breach of the Privacy Act, unless you take it right through the Human Rights Review Tribunal, are pretty minuscule. They're more like a license than a breach. But so that's the first thing, is that I think data minimization, by dint of people making that conscious choice to minimize, and by virtue of assessing the risk and deciding not to collect it, is going to be a good thing. And then, as I say, I think beyond that, you know, if I focus on collection, sometimes we focus too much on collection, in my view. I think what we should be focusing on is use, and making sure that the purpose for which the information is collected, whether that's be it by informed consent or just by virtue of New Zealand regime, where you can only collect it for a lawful purpose and only use it for that purpose, that should be the focus. And that's where we should be saying, look, you said you were going to collect it for this, you're using it for that. That's where the hammer should fall, because that's a choice that the commercial organisation is making, right? They're looking to leverage that data. Okay, they've got it from wherever they got it, whether it's through informed consent or from someone else. Yeah, in a sense, subject to the minimisation and the risk that that data is going to be leaked, I'm not less concerned, but I'm more sanguine about it, because I think the horse is bolted. The real issue is about how do you use it and what are you going to do with it.
Good points. There is a lot of global pushback in terms of addressing collection, right? I totally agree with use, but I think it's a layered approach. I think if we can start out by minimizing collection and then apply use, principles to it, that's great. But we've still got this situation where we've got a New Zealand Privacy Act that doesn't currently act as kind of any data protection. I don't see anything happening in the courts. That it's not. It's just not an active. And additionally, it's things are very ill-defined. They're very vague. Specifically, if we look at the only clause in it that relates to children. So when we're collecting information from children or young persons, we do so in a fair and reasonable manner. I think there might be even a clause, something say that it does not intrude to an unreasonable extent upon the personal affairs of the individual concerned. This is not defined in the current modern challenge that we have, in terms of how and what data is collected and who has that, its longevity, all those sorts of things. The other thing that I take issue with the Privacy Act is it says a legitimate purpose, a lawful purpose, legitimate business purpose. What does that mean? And should we have businesses in schools and even in children's lives as consumers exploiting them and their data when it can have serious consequences later on? So I think that purpose is extraordinarily useful way to sort of look at it, but we need that kind of regulatory framework against which schools, parents, anybody, individuals and children themselves can feel that they have some rights in this area and feel that they are protected, and that it applies to all companies that children here access. International, and when we look at companies like Google, Microsoft, etc., they have a monopoly globally in schools. They're creating a range of products. These are the ones that children are told that they need to learn to function in the world when they get out. It actually kind of stifles creativity. It's kind of a boarded tech. Diversity is a good thing. Opening up that space for more privacy conscious edtech providers. I think New Zealand could really be a leader in this industry worldwide if they chose to look at it that way. We've got to really sort of think about how do we take what we already have internationally, our standards, our human rights principles, our UN CRC principles around children and their digital rights, their rights to participate, not just safely, but to have their privacy respected. You know, we've got to translate that into this New Zealand debate and into something that really assists all stakeholders in kind of achieving a much higher level of privacy protection and safeguard for children.
I agree with you, Caroline, that you know, the Privacy Act, with all its changes to meet, you know, the digital age, 2020, just did not go far enough. It didn't go, well, it didn't really move for children and their rights. And I remember being in one of the forums where it was an overview of the changes and specifically asking around what's changed, what's new when we think about children and their rights and in educational organisations. So two arms to that question. And it was very little has changed. And as you say, it's a bit nebulous and unclear. So, you know, that's not good enough. That is not good enough when we think about it across all the things that we've covered, you know, this morning in that panel. I would just like to very briefly, pragmatically speak about what can a school do? What does it look like when we think best practice in a school or kura? And very briefly, having robust policies and procedures. The privacy officer that a school and kura is required to have, giving them the opportunity to have professional learning, to keep up to date with the privacy expectations, the concepts that are there, the expectations around legislation with the Privacy Act, Harmful Digital Communications Act, other laws and requirements under the National Administration Guidelines to keep an environment that is safe, both emotionally and physically for students. Those policies would be in speak that is very clear and easy for the community and iwi to understand. They would be visible on websites and accessible or tucked in so that all community could read and see what that school does by way of practice and protection. That students have an opportunity to learn themselves around privacy, about the online environment, about the skills, the literacies, the values and attitudes that are needed to become you know, great citizens, capable, contributing and enjoy as their writers that online environment. So, you know, it is a journey, and it is, you know, triangulation between whānau, students, and those responsible for them in the learning context.
Wonderful, thank you, Angie. All right, team, we have come to the end. There are some questions that we didn't get to, unfortunately, but such amazing kōrero held today, and thank you again for your time and for sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, your experience. I'm just going to close the proceedings with a karakia. Ka whakairia te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia tūriki whakataha ai, kia tūriki whakataha ai. Haumie, huie, tai ki e. Thank you, everybody.
Kia ora.